Hello everyone, welcome to A Clear Perspective. I'm Serene. On Friday, America and China began the Alaska meeting with a rough start. They exchanged fierce words with each other. China's Foreign Affairs Chief Yang Jiechi lost his temper. The meeting was attended by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, with top foreign policy officials Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi from China. The agreed protocol was that each person had 2 minutes for opening remarks. Since the U.S. was hosting the meeting, Blinken went first. His speech was 2 minutes and 27 seconds. Blinken kept his promise and went straight to the point. He criticized the CCP for its abusive behaviors. He outlined an agenda for the meeting. We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, and economic coercion toward our allies. And then he emphasized each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability. Blinken spoke these harsh remarks in a calm manner. Jake Sullivan's speech was a bit shorter. He declared his position up front. We do not seek conflict, but we welcome stiff competition, and we will always stand up for our principles, for our people, and for our friends. It appears that Sullivan is too naive in understanding the nature of the CCP. The CCP is a tyrant that uses violence to have its way. Usually, as soon as its opponent softens, the CCP goes after them relentlessly. As predicted, CCP Representative Yang's opening remarks were aggressive and offensive. He caught everyone by surprise and spoke for 16 minutes and 14 seconds. After that, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke for 4 minutes 9 seconds. Unexpectedly, Yang opened his speech by outlining a list of the CCP's achievements. He brought up the CCP's 14th Five-Year Economic and Social Development Plan and the long-term objectives for 2035. Then he talked about the CCP's self-proclaimed victory in ending absolute poverty in China and fighting COVID-19, actually the CCP virus. Finally, he gave a lengthy criticism of the U.S. What was Yang's criticism? He asked the United States to stop promoting the American democracy because the CCP has its own way of dealing with things. Also, the United States has its own human rights problems. Yang made a point. Many people within the United States actually have little confidence in the democracy of the United States. Yang also said confidently that China will not accept the unwarranted accusations from the U.S. side. He claimed, "Our history will show that one can only cause damages to himself if he wants to strangle or suppress the Chinese people." Yang also said proudly, "Our values are the same as the common values of humanity." Furthermore, Yang accused the United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength. The U.S. side was not even qualified to say such things even 20 years or 30 years back, because this is not the way to deal with the Chinese people. Obviously, Blinken did not expect this from the Chinese delegates at all. According to the rules, the representatives of both sides were supposed to give 2 minutes speech each. Then the media on the scene should leave. After that, it would be a closed-door conversation between the two sides. After the Chinese side's long speech, the journalists were ready to leave. Blinken urgently called for the journalists to come back. He then spoke for 2 more minutes. Blinken said that the United States
acknowledges our imperfections, acknowledges that we're not perfect, we make mistakes, we have reversals, we take steps back. But what we've done throughout our history is to confront those challenges openly, publicly, transparently, not trying to ignore them, not trying to pretend they don't exist, not trying to sweep them under a rug. And sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's ugly, but each and every time we've come out stronger, better, more united as a country.
Many Chinese commentators saw the speech as a public admission of fault. Blinken's remarks weren't very harsh, especially when compared to Yang Jiechi. They actually seem to be justifying the United States' actions. The irony is that the CCP never would admit its mistakes. This is something that diplomats often do, maintaining a gentle demeanor while also being tough. If Blinken were dealing with a normal diplomatic adversary, his response would be considered appropriate. But there is a problem with this strategy. The CCP is not like any organizations in the West. A recurring problem that we've seen in people raised in the West is that they do not know how to deal with the CCP. In democratic countries, people follow the rules and have a common sense of what is right and what is wrong. However, this is not a phenomenon that exists with people that grew up under the CCP, and is something that people of other countries fail to grasp. If Pompeo were at the meeting, I think it would be reasonable to assume that Pompeo would have just stood up and left, suspending the talks. The logic is that since right from the beginning, the guests, the Chinese officials, decided to ignore the rules and the regulations in a manner bordering on verbal abuse, the host has every right to cancel the event or even have them leave. Although Trump and Pompeo were raised in America, they've been two of the few people we've seen that have a thorough understanding of how to deal with the CCP. They know that the CCP is a disease that has to be isolated and removed. We saw that although Blinken was pretty moderate throughout his speech, he ended his additional remarks by showing toughness, saying, "It's never a good bet to bet against America, and it's true today." His remarks were obviously in response to Xi Jinping's saying, "The East is rising and the West is declining." Mike Pompeo tweeted on Friday, "Strength deters bad guys, weakness begets war," which I think describes quite well how to deal with the CCP. We have just discussed the situation from the US perspective, and now let's look at this meeting from China's side. This is actually the focus of today's topic. That is, whether Yang's outburst was a carefully rehearsed speech or an improvisation. Based on my understanding, the CCP has attached great importance to this meeting. From the actions taken by both sides before the meeting, it was clear that the US was trying to downplay the importance of the meeting as much as possible. This includes the location of the meeting place, Blinken's deliberate arrangement to drop by the meeting on his return trip, and his announcement of sanctions against 24 Chinese and Hong Kong officials before the meeting. All of this suggests that the US believed itself to have a dominant position in the meeting. China attended the meeting knowing that it was a humiliating arrangement. The US had repeatedly stated the meeting was nothing but a one-time arrangement with no follow-ups. But the Chinese domestic media reported it as a high-profile strategic meeting with the US. All these signs show that the CCP has attached great importance to this meeting. Why? Because China sees it as an opportunity to be released from the suffocation of the Trump administration. From this perspective, Yang would not have dared to speak the way he did without permission from the top. He would not have had the guts to mess up this meeting. Therefore, Yang's performance was not an impromptu act on a whim. It must have come from Xi Jinping. In other words, his speech was not simply to show his loyalty to Xi, nor was he expressing his wishes. He was actually tasked with presenting Xi's words to the US and the rest of the world. Some of you may ask, what is the purpose of Xi doing this? He attaches great importance to this meeting and yet uses wolf warrior diplomacy in trying to suppress the U.S. Is he not afraid of this plan backfiring on himself? This looks a bit contradictory, but it is not. In my opinion, Xi's purpose is twofold. On the one hand, he wants to seize the dominant position in the meeting, or at least to show that the CCP has the upper hand. On the other hand, he wants to test the waters to see whether Biden will yield. Let's talk about the first approach. Before the meeting, everyone could see that the U.S. dominated on all fronts. From the U.S.-Japan joint statement, the sanctions against CCP officials, and the delisting 3 Chinese telecom companies, we can see that America had the advantage. The CCP could only use hostage diplomacy. They charged 2 Canadians with espionage. The CCP knows that they have no cards to play, so to get initiative at the meeting, they decided to land a preemptive strike. In a way, the CCP has succeeded. Although the rest of the world has seen the CCP's wolf warrior diplomacy and their arrogant attitude, the CCP does not care anymore. They purportedly don't care what the rest of the world think about their crude behavior as long as they can achieve their goals. This is the biggest difference we see between Xi Jinping and Mao Zedong. Mao at least tried to put on the facade, but Xi doesn't care anymore. The second reason is that Xi is using this opportunity to test Biden's limit. As we mentioned earlier, why was the CCP not arrogant during the Pompeo era? We saw that in a meeting in Hawaii, Yang Jiechi stuck strictly to the script and was acting very friendly towards Pompeo. I believe that the CCP knows that they cannot go against Pompeo, as they would have had the rug pulled out from under them. In other words, if Biden does not express anger after Yang's public scolding of the U.S., the tone of U.S.-China relations will basically be set. While under negotiations, if the other side does not fight back after you publicly humiliate them, it can only mean one thing. They don't have any real strengths and are trying to hide their weaknesses. So how will the weakness be exploited? There is a tactic the CCP have used for a long time. They will put on a tough act in public, emphasizing how they will never give in. But once behind closed doors, their attitude changes immediately. They will slap a smile on their face and offer gifts and please their opponents. It is essentially a classic performance of good cop and bad cop. Though it sounds simple, this is what the CCP has been using against hostile countries for many years. Countries that are more conservative in their diplomacy might be surprised when dealing with the CCP's negotiations. They might find themselves in a trapped and uncomfortable position. Early on the morning of the 19th, reports on a meeting between U.S. and Chinese officials were released. As previously mentioned, the meeting started with an aggressive speech. However, once the meeting was brought behind closed doors, a senior administration official said the first session of talks was substantive, serious, and direct. In fact, the discussion went well beyond the 2 hours we had allotted. This account was also largely consistent with official reports from the CCP's state media. A reporter from overseas party media Phoenix TV asked Wang Yi about the talks. Wang said the second round of talks went fairly well, with many regional issues discussed and many more to be discussed tomorrow. When the reporter asked whether the talks had met expectations, Wang replied that they had no expectations to begin with. Did the CCP really have no expectations? At least, the Wall Street Journal reported that the CCP was planning to ask the U.S. to reverse restrictions on Huawei. If the talks did go smoothly, as Wang had said, does this mean the Biden administration relented? Let's wait and see. Let's briefly summarize. Yang's long speech was obviously prepared in advance and could not have been an impromptu after hearing Blinken's speech. Therefore, Yang did not intend to abide by the 2-minute speaking time limit from the very beginning. This was a planned diplomatic attack in accordance with Xi's wishes. The purpose was to disrupt the pace of the U.S. side and seize the initiative in the talks. It will also test Biden's policy toward the Chinese Communist Party. Finally, a small piece of news that I wanted to share. A short video was circulating showing a 2-sentence conversation between Wang and Yang before the talks. Wang asked, "Did you have lunch?" Yang replied, "I had instant noodles." This certainly reminds us of what a senior Chinese diplomat said about the meeting. It is not at all hospitable, nor does it conform to diplomatic etiquette. Obviously, the two Chinese officials were very concerned about the food and accommodations. Why were no meals arranged? The U.S. explained it was because of the pandemic. But in June last year, when the pandemic had ravaged the world, Pompeo met with Yang Jiechi for 6 hours in Hawaii and still arranged to have lunch. So I personally think the lack of food and hospitality this time is a deliberate arrangement by Blinken, which sends a political signal. I just stopped by to see you. I don't treat you as a serious guest, so I don't need to consider any hospitality. We all know that the Chinese people, including these two Chinese officials, are probably unmatched in terms of their attention to food. From this perspective, it cannot be ruled out that the small part of the anger from Yang came from the poor food. That's all for today. Wish you all have a good weekend. See you next week.